Ethan's days always began the same way, with the groan of the depot gates and the smell of diesel hanging thick in the air. He was a man built from routine, moving through life as steadily as the bus he drove, mile after mile. His face bore lines not just from age, but from years of being overlooked. The city's noise seemed to pass through him like wind through a cracked window. He had long stopped expecting much more than a paycheck and a quiet ride home. Yet behind his calm, gray eyes, there lived a quiet dream, a hope for dignity, for being seen not as just another driver in a faded uniform, but as a man with worth. At the depot, he was a target, not in a cruel, violent way, but in the casual manner of bored men who liked to laugh at someone else's expense. "Still no date, Ethan?" they'd say, chuckling as they slapped his back. "Careful, the cobwebs are growing on your shoulders." Their jokes always landed the same way, sharp enough to sting, dull enough to be brushed off. Ethan never fought back. He only smiled faintly, adjusted his cap, and walked on. Silence had become his shield. The gala was all anyone talked about that week, the annual gathering where drivers and their partners dressed up, where cheap wine was poured into plastic glasses, and the best stories of the year were told again under bright lights. For the younger men, it was a chance to show off dates, to laugh and drink. For Ethan, it had always been something distant, a room he belonged to in title, but not in spirit. He had never brought anyone, and the empty seat beside him had become another running joke. It was during one of those breaks, when the drivers lounged near the coffee machine, that the teasing grew louder. "Bring a date this time, Ethan," one of them sneered. "Or will it be just you and your bus again?" Laughter roared and Ethan's ears burned. He sipped his coffee slowly, saying no's thing, until another voice chimed in, sly and mocking. "Why don't you invite that little girl who rides your bus every morning, the one with paint on her fingers? What's her name? Maya?" Ethan felt a stir in his chest at the mention. He knew her well, quiet, always with a sketchbook pressed against her chest, second-hand clothes neat but worn, her hands stained with colors like she carried a rainbow beneath her nails. She boarded at the same stop each day, nodding politely, her smile small but real. He had spoken to her only in fragments, comments about the weather, a reminder about forgotten change, but even in those seconds, there was something about her presence that softened the morning. The men were watching him now, waiting for his embarrassment. A dare lingered in the air, unspoken but sharp. Ethan placed his cup down, feeling the weight of their stares. "Fine," he muttered, voice low but steady. "I'll invite her." The laughter that followed echoed down the depot hall. They thought it was another of his quiet defeats, another moment where they had bent him into their joke. Later that day, as Maya stepped onto the bus, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, Ethan surprised himself. His voice caught in his throat, but he forced the words out with an awkward smile. "There's a gala this weekend," he said, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Drivers bring guests sometimes. If you'd like to come." Maya blinked, startled, then gave a small, polite nod. She didn't laugh, didn't question, just accepted the folded scrap of paper he handed her with the details. Ethan's heart pounded as the bus rumbled forward. He knew what he had done. It was a dare, a shield against their mockery, nothing more. But as he drove on, a strange unease settled in him. He never expected her to show up, not a girl like her, not to a night like that. And yet, as the city bus lured by, he couldn't stop replaying her quiet nod, the way she had held that slip of paper carefully, as though it were something more than a joke. Laughter, but with silence, the kind that follows a whisper of possibility. Maya sat by the window of the bus, her sketchbook balanced on her knees, her fingers smudged with blue and gold as though she had dipped them into the sky itself. Every day she painted on scraps of paper. She could find receipts, torn envelopes, whatever she could save and tuck into her worn leather bag. Yet in those scraps, she poured entire worlds. Ethan drove as he always did, steady eyes on the road. Yet inside his chest, there was an unfamiliar weight. The memory of his careless invitation lingered. He told himself it was nothing, a shield against their cruel laughter, but the sight of Maya clutching that paper as though it meant something stirred guilt and curiosity. What if she really came? What if she believed he had meant it? Maya was not used to invitations. Her life had been a series of closed doors and whispered dismissals. People looked past her, the way they looked past cracks in the sidewalk, invisible until they tripped over them. She painted because paper never laughed at her colors, never judged. Sometimes she imagined a future where her art hung in warm galleries where people leaned close and gasped, not at her poverty, but at her vision. But those dreams lived only in the pages she kept hidden. Still, she had heard something different in Ethan's voice that morning. It had not been sharp, like the jeers she sometimes overheard from other drivers. It had been hesitant, almost gentle, the kind of voice that left room for choice, and she had nodded, not out of politeness, but because for the first time in a long while, someone had asked her to step into a room she had never been welcomed into before. That evening at the depot, Ethan found himself the subject of more mockery. His co-workers slapped his back, telling him they could not wait to meet his mystery girl. They painted pictures of his humiliation with cruel delight. Ethan forced a smile, but the truth gnawed at him. What if Maya did arrive? What if she stood there fragile against their scorn? He could not bear the thought. He told himself she would not come. Girls like her never walked into ballrooms filled with sneering men. Yet the city had a way of shaping quiet rebellions the next morning. As Maya boarded the bus, she did not sit at the back. She chose the seat nearest to him, close enough for her sketchbook to catch the light. She looked at him once, steady eyes, unflinching. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He wanted to speak to warn her that his invitation was not meant to be taken so seriously, but the words withered on his tongue. Suspense hung in the air between them like a thread ready to snap each glance, each silence adding to the weight. Ethan told himself this was nothing but. He knew deep down the story had already shifted the moment she held on to that paper, the moment she chose to sit near him. The road ahead no longer looked ordinary. It looked like the beginning of something that would test both of them in ways neither expected. The sound of laughter echoing through the depot, the kind of laughter that cut deeper than words. Ethan stood at the edge of the group, his hands buried in his jacket pockets, while the other drivers circled around like wolves, waiting for the feast. Their eyes gleamed with the promise of his downfall. They spoke loudly enough for him to hear, making jokes about invisible girlfriends and empty chairs at the gala. One even raised a glass of bitter coffee and mock toast to the man who would sit alone again. But the mocking did not end there. It turned sharper when they mentioned Maya. They called her the paint girl, the bus shadow, the stray, who scribbled on scraps of paper. They laughed as though the very idea of her stepping into their glittering hall was unthinkable. Ethan clenched his jaw, trying to drown out their words. Yet inside he felt a storm building. If she did come and heard this cruelty, how could she stand against it? How could he protect her when he had been the one who opened the door to this humiliation? The night before, the gala approached like a slow-moving storm. Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the folded invitation stub he had copied for Maya. The words blurred under his tired eyes. He told himself again she would not show. She was too sensible, too gentle to step into a room filled with poison. She would save herself the pain still. He could not shake the memory of her steady gaze, the way she had sat near him. Her silence filled with a strength he could not name. Maya, meanwhile, sat on the edge of her narrow bed, her small lamp casting light over the sketches scattered around her. She touched the invitation with fingertips stained in charcoal. She knew what people thought of her. She had heard the whispers at the bus stop, seen the glances at her worn shoes, but she also knew the fire that lived in her chest, the one her mother had told her never to let die. Maybe this night it would end in laughter. Maybe she would be the joke, but she also felt that sometimes a woman had to step into the storm to show the world she could stand tall. The suspense grew like a shadow stretching across the city. The depot buzzed with excitement. Men planned their entrances, their suits, their laughter. Ethan drove his route in silence, his mind torn between dreading her arrival and secretly hoping for it. His co-workers sharpened their words like knives, preparing for the spectacle. The tension wound tighter with each hour. When Friday arrived, the day of the gala, the depot was alive with cruel anticipation. Ethan heard them placing bets. One said she would never come. Another claimed she would show and run away in shame. The words filled the air like smoke, and he stood in the center of it, suffocating, unable to defend her, unable even to defend himself. He climbed into his bus that morning, heavy with dread. Yet when Maya stepped aboard, she did not look down, she did not hide. She walked past the rows of passengers and took her seat near him once more, her sketchbook resting on her lap as though she had already decided. In that moment, Ethan felt the world tilt. The laughter of his co-workers faded, replaced by the pounding of his own heart. Something was coming, something powerful that none of them were ready for. The gala was no longer just a gathering, it was the stage where everything would break wide open. The quiet rustle of fabric in a small, dimly lit room. Maya stood before a cracked mirror, studying the girl staring back at her. She hardly recognized herself. Her hair, usually tied back in messy knots, now framed her face with soft waves. Borrowed pins held it neatly, though a few rebellious strands fell across her cheek. Her dress was not new, it had been passed down from a neighbor, a deep blue gown with a faint shimmer. But when Maya slipped into it and smoothed the fabric over her frame, it felt like armor. She pressed her palm against her heart and whispered to the photo of her late mother propped on the dresser. Tonight, they will see me not as the girl with paint on her hands, not as the passenger in second-hand clothes, but as who I truly am. The words were simple, but the conviction in them shook her. She had spent her life hiding behind sketches and smudges. But tonight, she chose to step into the light. As she prepared, suspense tightened around her. Every choice would matter. The earrings she clipped on had belonged to her mother. Tiny silver hoops that caught the lamplight. She dabbed a hint of color on her lips using a sample tube she had saved for years. She stared at herself again, marveling at the transformation. Her eyes seemed brighter, her posture straighter. The girl who had been invisible was gone, replaced by someone who demanded to be seen. Meanwhile, Ethan sat in his apartment, his suit laid out across the chair. It was the same one he wore to funerals and weddings, a suit that hung on him like a reminder of every place he had never truly belonged. His hands shook as he adjusted the tie. He told himself again, she would not come. He prayed, she would not come for her sake, not his. He could bear their laughter, but he could not bear seeing it fall on her shoulders yet beneath the worry. A part of him longed for her presence. A part of him wanted to see her walk into that hall and silence. Them all, at the depot, his co-workers were already gathering, slicked hair, polished shoes, cruel smirks painted on their faces. One leaned close to Ethan and muttered, "Hope, you brought tissues, you'll need them. When your date never shows," the others laughed, but Ethan stayed quiet, his silence only feeding their hunger. They thought the night would be theirs, a night to tear him down once more. As the city lights flickered alive, Maya stepped into the cool evening air, her borrowed heels clicking softly against the pavement. Every step felt heavier, the fear pressing down on her, but her resolve held stronger. She clutched a small purse her neighbor had loaned her. Inside was nothing but a folded napkin with the gala's address written on it, and a small charcoal pencil she carried everywhere, her talisman of courage. She approached the grand hall from a distance, the glow spilling out through tall windows, music drifting into the night. She paused, her breath shallow. She could almost hear their laughter waiting for her. But then she lifted her chin and moved forward. The door loomed ahead, suspense curling tighter with every step. She reached for the handle, whispering again to her mother, "Watch me tonight." Inside, Ethan sat at his table alone, the mocking glances cutting him sharper with each passing moment. The empty chair beside him glared back like a wound. The band began to play and the first glasses were raised. When the doors suddenly opened, a hush fell over the room. Ethan turned his head, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Silence, the kind that does not ask for attention but commands it. The grand doors creaked open and every laugh, every glass, every whispered insult stopped. Maya stepped inside her blue gown, catching the golden glow of the chandeliers. Her hair framed her face like a halo, her eyes steady, her posture straight, as if she had been born for this moment. She did not stumble, she did not shrink, she simply walked, and the room froze. The men who had mocked Ethan the loudest were the first to fall quiet, their smirks slipping away as though stolen from their faces. Women turned their heads whispering to one another, wondering who she was. The band even faltered on a note as all eyes followed the girl who entered, not with arrogance, but with a quiet radiance that made her untouchable. Ethan felt his chest seize. He had prepared himself for humiliation. He had braced for an empty seat and another night of ridicule. He had told himself 1,000 lies to shield against the pain. But he had never prepared for this. His eyes widened, his breath caught, and for the first time in years he stood without hesitation. He rose from his chair, as though drawn by a force greater than himself. Maya's gaze met his across the room. She did not smile, but there was something in her eyes that spoke louder than any word. It told him she was not here to hide. She was not here to be mocked. She was here because she chose to be. She crossed the hall, slowly, her heels clicking softly like a drumbeat of defiance, and each step made the laughter of the past seem smaller, more pitiful. The men at Ethan's table shifted uncomfortably. One tried to force a laugh, but it died in his throat. Another muttered under his breath, yet none dared to speak aloud. The power had shifted, and they knew it. Ethan extended his hand, trembling, unsure if she would take it, unsure if he deserved for her to take it. But Maya reached out her fingers, warm her grip. Teddy, and the hall erupted into stunned silence. Together, they walked to the center of the room. The band recovered and played a softer tune, and without asking, Ethan guided her into a dance. His hands awkward at first, his steps uncertain, but Maya moved with grace and ease as though she had rehearsed for this. Her gown swirled with every turn, her eyes never leaving his, and in that moment Ethan realized she was not just saving him from ridicule, she was rewriting the story of who he was. The whispers began, not cruel now, but filled with awe. Who is she? Where did she come from? How did Ethan of all people bring a woman like that? The suspense in the hall grew not from mockery, but from disbelief. Something had shifted in the foundation of their world, and no one could explain it. Ethan felt it too, the weight of years of silence, the years of being invisible melting away under the light of her presence. He had invited her as a joke, but standing there with her hand in his, he knew the night would not end as anyone expected. A gasp that rippled through the hall, as if the very air had been struck. Maya moved with poise, her blue gown shimmering like liquid night, each step carrying her deeper into the heart of the room. The chandeliers seemed to bend their light toward her, and the crowd parted instinctively. She was no longer the quiet girl from the bus. She was something untouchable, a vision that demanded reverence. Ethan felt his palms damp as he guided her across the floor. The music swelled, but even the melody seemed afraid to compete with her presence. He could sense the weight of 100 eyes burning into them. Whispers fluttered from table to table, half-spoken questions mixing with disbelief. Some guests craned their necks, hoping to find a flaw, something to laugh at, but there was nothing. She stood too tall, her expression too calm, her confidence carved from something deeper than borrowed fabric. The drivers who had mocked Ethan sat frozen, their drinks untouched, their faces pale. One tried to smirk to recover his control, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. Another muttered, "She's not real, she can't be." But no one listened. Their eyes betrayed awe and envy. Maya paused at the center, her gaze sweeping the hall, her chin lifted. She was not here to prove herself. She was here to exist without apology, and the silence that followed struck harder than any insult could have. Ethan's chest tightened as pride surged through him. He had never seen her like this. Never imagined the quiet girl who carried paint under her fingernails could step into a storm and silence it with nothing more than her presence. But silence never lasts long. Jealousy thrives in the shadows. One of Ethan's co-workers, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, rose from his chair and clapped slowly, the sound cutting through the hush, sarcastic applause that carried venom. "Well, well," he said, drawing every eye back to him. "Look who finally found himself a queen." He smirked, but his words wavered under the pressure of her steady gaze. Suspense coiled tighter. The hall waited for her to falter, for her to shrink back into the shy girl they thought they knew. Instead, Maya smiled, a small, quiet smile that reached her eyes. She stepped closer to Ethan, the soft swish of her gown echoing louder than the man's cruel claps. She extended her hand to the band, and with a single nod, the music changed. A slower rhythm filled the space, and before anyone could speak, she placed Ethan's hand on her waist and began to dance. The room erupted in whispers, disbelief twisting into reluctant admiration. Couples shifted uneasily as the pair moved across the floor. The man who had mocked her dropped back into his seat, defeated, unable to match the quiet power she exuded. The suspense no longer hung on whether she belonged. It hung on how far she would carry this moment, how completely she would undo the story they had written about Ethan. Ethan's steps grew surer, his body loosening as Maya's presence steadied him. For the first time in years, he felt visible, not as the butt of a cruel joke, but as a man who mattered. Each turn, each breath, each glance pulled him deeper into her orbit, and he knew the night had only begun. The sound of music filling every corner of the hall, the melody wrapped around Ethan and Maya as they moved across the floor, their steps no longer uncertain, their rhythm growing stronger with each turn. Whispers followed them, but the cruel laughter that once hovered like smoke was gone, replaced by something heavier, something close to awe. Ethan's heart pounded with every beat of the song. He had never been a man who danced, never been a man anyone looked at twice, but now the eyes of the entire hall clung to him, not because of his uniform or the jokes that once defined him, but because of the woman in his arms. Her presence transformed him in their eyes, and he felt the shift like a wave crashing over his chest. Maya lifted her chin, her eyes bright, her expression calm, but beneath it her pulse thundered. She knew the stakes. She knew she had walked into a room waiting to devour her, and instead she had forced them to bow in silence. Her every move was deliberate, a brush of her hand, a turn of her body. She was not just dancing with Ethan. She was declaring something to every person watching. I am not your joke. I am not invisible. Then came the challenge. A sharp voice cut through the music. One of the senior drivers, emboldened by drink, rose to his feet, his words heavy with scorn. This is all a show, he sneered. The girl's dressed up for one night, but we know what she really is, a stray from the streets. She doesn't belong here. The hall tensed, eyes darting between Maya and Ethan. The music faltered, suspense tightened like a rope ready to snap. Ethan felt the sting of shame rising again, the old instinct to bow his head, to accept their cruelty. But before he could speak, Maya turned her gaze toward the man. Her calm so steady, it shook him, more than anger would have. She stepped forward, her gown brushing the floor, her voice clear and strong. I may not have riches, she said, but every morning I rise and I work. I carry more dignity in my paint-stained hands than some carry in their polished shoes. The hall fell silent. No one moved. The senior driver's smirk faltered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of her words. For the first time, Ethan saw what true courage looked like, not in loud defiance, but in quiet truth, spoken without fear. Pride swelled inside him. He stepped to her side, his voice steady. She belongs here more than anyone else tonight. And in that moment, he realized he was no longer afraid of their laughter. The band struck up again. The tension broke into uneasy applause, some sincere, some forced. But the power in the room had shifted forever. Maya and Ethan returned to the dance floor, their connection stronger, forged by fire. What had begun as survival had turned into defiance, and the hall could not look away. Unease slipping back into the hall, the music played. The guests swayed, but beneath the surface, envy grew like fire under ash. The men who once laughed at Ethan now watched in silence. Their pride bruised their egos, burning every smile that crossed Maya's face. Every glance she gave Ethan was another blow to their pride. They had built their amusement on his humiliation, and tonight he had stolen their stage. One man in particular could not bear it. He had been the loudest voice in mocking Ethan, the one who had pushed him into making the invitation in the first place. His jealousy clawed at him as he watched the girl who was supposed to be the joke turn into the queen of the night. He slammed his glass down, the sharp sound cutting through the music, and drew the eyes of those around him. So tell us, he sneered, where did you find her? Really, was she waiting outside the depot, hoping someone would notice her? Laughter rippled weakly across a few tables, but it lacked the bite it once had. The crowd was divided. Some leaned closer to Maya. Curious, others frowned at the cruelty. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but Maya stepped forward, her gaze never leaving the man. You want to know where I come from? She said, her voice steady. I come from small rooms and long nights. I come from paint stains and empty pockets, but I also come from courage and dreams larger than this hall. Her words struck the air like a blade. Silence followed, the kind that makes even the cruelest man hesitate. The jealous driver sneered, but his smirk faltered under her calm strength. He reached for another insult, but the room no longer supported him. Guests shifted uncomfortably, their admiration for Maya beginning to outweigh their loyalty to the old hierarchy. For the first time, Ethan saw fear flicker in the eyes of those who had once controlled every laugh, every jeer. Ethan stepped beside her, voice low but firm. "You have mocked me for years, but tonight you mock her, and that I will not allow." It was the first time he had spoken against them, the first time he had lifted his head high. The weight of his words hung heavy, and for once no one dared to answer. Suspense thickened. The night was no longer just a gathering. It had become a battlefield of pride and truth. Maya stood unshaken, her gown glowing under the chandeliers, her hand brushing Ethan's as though to remind him he was no longer alone together. They faced the crowd, and something in that quiet defiance unsettled every whisper of mockery. The jealous driver sank back into his chair, defeated. Though his eyes promised the fight was not finished, Ethan and Maya returned to the center, the music rising again. But the hall was forever changed. They were no longer waiting for her to fail. They were waiting to see what she would conquer next. In the cool air outside the hall, the music still drifted faintly through the doors. But here, under the night sky, it felt quieter, more fragile. Ethan leaned against the stone wall, his breath unsteady, his hands still trembling from the fire inside. He had spent the evening fighting to keep his composure, yet now alone with her, the weight of everything pressed down his chest. Maya stood a few steps away, her gown brushing the ground, the moonlight painting her in silver. She looked nothing like the shy girl who clutched her sketchbook on the bus. Her presence was fierce, yet her eyes softened when they met his. Ethan wanted to speak, but words stuck in his throat. Finally, he forced them out, his voice low. "I never meant for this to happen. I invited you as a joke, because they dared me to, and I am ashamed of it." Suspense held the moment between them, her silence cutting sharper than anger. Maya turned her gaze toward the street, her lips trembling. She whispered, "I knew." He blinked, confused. "You knew?" She nodded, her eyes shimmering. "I heard them laugh that morning. I saw the way they looked at you, and I understood. But when you gave me that paper, I told myself maybe just once I could walk into a room, not as a shadow, but as someone who belonged." The confession struck him harder than any insult ever. Had he realized she had walked into that hall, knowing she might be torn apart, and yet she had stood taller than anyone inside. Ethan's throat tightened. "You were braver than me," he admitted. "I wanted to protect myself from their laughter. You walked straight into it." Maya stepped closer, her voice steady but filled with something raw. "I was tired of being invisible. If I was going to be seen, even as a joke, then I would choose how they saw me." Her eyes locked on his, and in that instant, Ethan felt the truth hit him. She had not just changed the night, she had changed him. She had shown him courage in a way he had never known. The suspense grew as footsteps echoed near the door. One of the jealous drivers slipped outside, his shadow falling across them. He smirked, thinking he might catch them broken. But when he saw Maya standing so close to Ethan, her eyes unwavering, he faltered. He muttered something bitter under his breath and stumbled back inside. Defeated, Ethan turned to her, his voice rough with emotion. "You deserve better than tonight. You deserve better than me." But Maya shook her head quietly. "Tonight I chose to stand beside you," she whispered. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt the heavy chains of ridicule shatter her words, wrapping around him like armor. The night deepened, stars flickered above, and in the silence between them, something undeniable settled. Not just gratitude, not just admiration, but the first spark of love, a love born, not of ease, but of battle, fought side by side. Suspense lingered because both knew the night was not finished. The greatest reveal still waited behind those doors. The sudden call of the master of ceremonies, his voice carrying through the hall, asking all guests to return inside. Ethan and Maya exchanged a glance, the weight of their conversation still fresh in the night air. Ethan wanted to shield her from more cruelty, but Maya's expression was calm, almost certain. She touched his hand lightly and whispered, "We finish this together." They stepped back into the hall, and once again the music faltered. The crowd turned, eyes narrowing as if they were waiting for something to break. But there was a tension in the air that had shifted since Maya first entered, admiration, mixed with confusion, curiosity, sharpening every gaze. Ethan guided her to their table, but before they could sit, the organizer of the gala, a tall man with silver hair, approached the stage and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, he announced. Tonight is not only our annual celebration, but also a chance to honor talent beyond our walls. We are privileged to have among us someone whose work has already begun to touch the world. Ethan frowned, confused, but Maya's breath caught in her throat. She knew what was coming. The organizer lifted a paper from the podium, his voice ringing out. We are proud to announce that the National Art Council has chosen to display the work of Maya Elias in the City Museum this spring. Her sketches and paintings have been hailed as visionary. He turned then and gestured to her. Please stand. Miss Elias. The room erupted in gasps. All eyes snapped to her. Ethan froze, his heart slamming against his ribs as the truth unfolded before him. Maya stood, her gown catching the light like a living flame. She did not bow, she did not shrink. She simply met their astonished stares with quiet dignity. The same men who had mocked her now whispered in disbelief, their earlier cruelty unraveling before their eyes. One of the drivers stammered, "But she rides the bus every day," another hissed. "She can't be the same girl, look at her." But the truth was undeniable. She was both the girl with paint-stained hands and the artist whose work would soon hang in the museum. She had carried worlds in her sketchbook, while they had only seen rags. They had been blind to her brilliance until now. Ethan felt his throat tighten, pride swelling so fierce it almost broke him. She had walked into that hall not to prove them wrong, but to live her truth, and in doing so, she had silenced every cruel voice that had shadowed them both. He stepped forward, his voice clear. This is the woman you mocked, and tonight she has shown more grace than any of us deserve. The applause that followed began hesitant, but soon grew, until the hall shook with it, genuine admiration rising like a tide. The jealous men shrank into their chairs, their power gone, their laughter silenced forever. Maya turned to Ethan, her eyes glistening with unspoken words, and in that moment, he understood what she had given him, not just her presence, but a chance to see himself through her courage. As the night drew on, they stood together in the center of the hall, the applause still echoing around them. Ethan whispered the words he had never dared before. You were never the joke, Maya. You were the answer. She smiled softly, the weight of her journey carried in that single look, and as the crowd watched in silence, the man who had once been invisible and the girl who had once been overlooked became something larger than either had imagined. The final image was of Maya, her hand in Ethan's, as they faced the hall together. No longer shadows, no longer subjects of cruel laughter, but symbols of what it means to rise when the world expects you to fall. The night that began with a dare ended as destiny, and the whole room knew they would never forget the woman who arrived like a goddess and froze time itself.